Blood was dripping from my mouth onto the cold linoleum floor of the gynecologist's waiting room. My stepbrother Will was standing over me, his fist still clenched, his voice echoing off the walls while other patients backed away in shock and fear. He was shouting that I had to choose how I would pay or get out, waving legal documents in my face and demanding that I sign them immediately. If I did not, he said he would make sure I never set foot in my father's house again. The stitches from the emergency surgery I had undergone just 3 days earlier felt as if they were tearing apart while I struggled to push myself up from the floor. A nurse was already calling emergency services, her hands shaking just as badly as mine, but Will did not care. He never did. My name is Donna Underwood. I am 32 years old. 2 weeks earlier, I had a future. I was pregnant, my father was alive and loved me deeply, and I had a home where I felt safe. Now I was bleeding on the floor of a medical office while my stepbrother tried to steal everything my father had left behind. It all began 3 days after my father's funeral. I had just lost my baby. What started as a miscarriage at 14 weeks turned into an emergency procedure when the bleeding would not stop. The doctors told me I was lucky to survive. People use that word so easily, lucky, without understanding what it really means. I was staying at my father's house, trying to recover both physically and emotionally, when Will and my stepmother Veronica arrived with a moving truck. They did not knock. Will used his key and walked in as if the house already belonged to him. Veronica followed behind him, wearing a mask of fake sympathy. She expressed sorrow about the baby, calling it a tragedy, but her eyes were already scanning the house, silently appraising my father's antiques and valuables. Will did not waste time. He placed a stack of papers on the kitchen counter, the same counter where my father used to make pancakes every Sunday morning. He declared that my father had left everything to him and Veronica. According to those documents, I would receive $10,000 if I signed immediately, and half that amount if I waited until the next day. I almost laughed. My father had raised me alone after my mother died when I was 7 years old. He built Underwood Construction from nothing into a company worth millions. There was no chance he would leave me out of his will. I told Will that his claim was ridiculous and that I wanted to see my father's real will. That was when his expression changed. His face turned the same dark shade I remembered from childhood, the look that always meant someone was about to get hurt. He insisted that the document was real and claimed my father had signed it 2 weeks before his death. He accused me of being too distracted by my pregnancy to notice that my father had written me out of his life. He referred to my loss as pregnancy drama. That was his description of losing my first child after years of trying. I tried to remain calm. I told him I needed time to think and that I wanted to speak with a lawyer. Will gave me 24 hours. When I went to my follow-up appointment at the gynecologist's office, Will was already there, waiting for me. At the time, I did not know how he found out about my appointment. I would later learn that Veronica had been going through my phone while I slept. He loudly announced that my time was up and demanded that I sign the papers immediately or leave the house that same day. I refused. That was when he struck me. The blow knocked me to the floor, and I tasted blood as it filled my mouth. My ribs, still sore from surgery, burned with pain. He stood over me and sneered, saying that I clearly thought I was too good for the money he had offered, and that now I would get nothing. The police arrived within minutes. Other patients gave statements, and Will tried to charm the officers, claiming he was grieving, and that family disagreements sometimes became emotional. But there was no explaining away a woman bleeding on the floor with a clear handprint on her face. He was arrested, though Veronica managed to bail him out within hours. That evening, my friend Margie drove me back to my father's house because I was too shaken to drive myself. When we arrived, the locks had been changed. All of my belongings had been thrown onto the front lawn. Clothes, books, photo albums, everything I owned lay scattered and soaked by the neighbors' sprinklers. What broke me completely was seeing my mother's jewelry box, the one my father gave her for their 10th anniversary, smashed open on the driveway. Her pearls were scattered across the concrete like tears. Margie helped me gather what we could salvage. She was 73 years old, a retired forensic accountant, and had been my father's close friend for 2 decades. As we picked up the ruined remnants of my life, she kept repeating that none of this was right, that my father would never have done this to me. She was right. Of course, my father would never have done this to me. He had spoken about his will many times, especially after his first heart attack the year before. Every time the subject came up, he said the same thing. Everything would be split fairly. Donna would be taken care of. Will and Veronica would receive the house in Florida and a fixed amount of money. The company employees would be protected through a pension fund. That was who my father was. Fair, loyal, and deeply responsible. As Margie and I loaded my damaged belongings into her old Buick, Mrs. Patterson from next door finally gathered the courage to come over. She kept glancing nervously toward the house, as if she expected Will to appear at any moment. In a hushed voice, she told me something she had not mentioned at the funeral. During the week before my father died, he had seemed extremely upset. One day he had borrowed her phone, saying he did not trust his own anymore. He believed someone was listening to him. That night, as I lay on Margie's couch with an ice pack pressed against my swollen face, I could not stop thinking about my father's final weeks. He had been acting strange, secretive, even paranoid. At the time, I blamed his heart medication, but now I began to wonder if something else had been wrong. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of glass breaking. Someone was trying to break into Margie's house. We called the police and hid together in her bedroom, gripping her late husband's old baseball bat. By the time officers arrived, whoever it was had disappeared. Before leaving, they discovered a message spray-painted on Margie's garage door, warning us to stop digging or face consequences. Will appeared the next morning, pretending to be concerned while barely hiding his threats. He commented on how dangerous the neighborhood was becoming and suggested that Margie might want to move somewhere safer. Margie was not intimidated. She confronted him directly, reminding him she had known him since he was a teenager stealing money from his mother. She ordered him off her property, making it clear she was not afraid of him. For the first time, he backed away. After he left, Margie opened her laptop. She reminded me that she had handled the accounting for my father's company for 15 years before retiring. She still had her access credentials, and my father had never been good about changing passwords. She decided it was time to see what Will had been doing behind the scenes. What we discovered was terrifying. For years, Will had been draining the company through fake invoices, shell companies, and non-existent employees. The theft was subtle, designed to avoid detection unless someone knew exactly where to look. Margie knew. In the last year alone, Will had stolen nearly $500,000. Margie explained that what we were seeing went far beyond internal fraud. These were serious federal crimes, including wire fraud and tax evasion, but there was something even more disturbing. The amounts being withdrawn had increased significantly about 6 months earlier, right around the time my father's heart condition had worsened. I remembered how my father's medication had been changed repeatedly during that period. Each adjustment made him weaker instead of better. Doctors had been confused by how poorly he responded to treatment. Margie suggested a possibility that made my blood run cold. Someone could have been tampering with his medication. She had seen similar cases during her career, where family members manipulated prescriptions to speed up an inheritance. That was when I remembered my father's last clear words to me in the hospital. He had urgently told me to check the basement safe, hidden behind the water heater. He gave me the combination, which was my mother's birthday. Shortly after saying this, the medication had taken effect, and he never woke up again. We knew we had to get into the house. Will and Veronica had changed the locks, but they did not know about the old basement window my father never repaired. It was the same window I used to sneak through when I was younger. Late that night, dressed in dark clothes, Margie and I crept across the backyard. Margie whispered that she could not believe she was breaking into a house at her age. I reminded her that legally, the house still belonged to the estate until probate was complete. The basement smelled like my father. Behind the water heater, hidden by a panel I had never noticed before, we found the safe. The combination worked immediately. Inside were 3 things that changed everything. There was my father's real will, properly notarized and dated just 1 month earlier. There was a thick folder filled with detailed evidence documenting Will's embezzlement. And there was a handwritten letter from my father, written with shaking hands. In the letter, he explained that his suspicions had been correct. He had felt worse since Will began helping with his medication after the heart attack. He had been secretly documenting everything. He had hired an outside forensic firm without telling anyone. He warned me that Will monitored his calls and told me to trust Margie and his longtime lawyer, Gary Garrison. He ended the letter by telling me not to let them win. As I finished reading, my hands were shaking. It was now clear that Will had been slowly poisoning my father, making it look like a natural decline. Then Margie opened another folder. Inside were old newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. They documented the deaths of Veronica's previous husbands. Each had died from medical conditions shortly after marriage. Each had left her everything. My father had been husband number 4. We took photographs of everything inside the safe, knowing we could not risk removing any of it yet. As Margie was carefully documenting the contents, she noticed something else. Will's computer upstairs was still logged in. She suggested we take a quick look before leaving. We moved quietly up the stairs. The house felt wrong without my father in it, as if even the walls knew something terrible had happened there. Will's email account turned out to be a gold mine of careless criminal behavior. Message after message revealed what he and Veronica had been doing. In his emails to her, Will openly described giving my father double doses of his medication, slipping extra pills into his coffee, and transferring money before audits could catch up to him. He wrote about my growing suspicions and how they needed to move faster. One message from 3 weeks earlier was especially disturbing. He wrote that if I refused to sign the documents, they would need to handle me the same way they handled my father. Reading those words made me feel sick. They had already decided what would happen to me. The next morning, we took everything to Gary Garrison, my father's lawyer for over 30 years. His office was above an old hardware store downtown, filled with dark wood paneling and shelves of aging law books. Though officially semi-retired, his mind was still sharp. When he saw the evidence, he slammed his desk and said he had known something was wrong. My father had come to him weeks earlier, terrified, convinced Will was plotting something but still needing proof. Gary explained that Will had not only stolen from the company, but from the employee pension fund as well. That alone made it a federal case. If we could also prove poisoning, the consequences would be far more serious. That was when Detective Riley arrived. She introduced herself and explained that she took these cases personally. Her own mother had once been slowly poisoned by a caregiver who wanted her inheritance. Riley told us she had already been investigating Veronica. Patterns had emerged after the deaths of her previous husbands, but she had always moved between states and waited just long enough to avoid suspicion. My father had been meant to be her final payout. Over the following week, we worked together to build the case. Margie traced the financial trails Will thought he had hidden. Gary prepared the legal documents needed to freeze the estate and prevent any transfer of assets. Detective Riley secured warrants for phone records, bank statements, and my father's medication bottles. The lab results confirmed what we feared. The pills contained 3 times the prescribed dosage of a heart medication. At that level, it would cause exactly the slow decline my father experienced, making his death appear natural. Still, Riley wanted more. She believed someone at the hospital had been helping provide extra medication. If we moved too quickly, that person might escape accountability. Gary then uncovered another critical detail. The notary who supposedly witnessed the fake Will had died in a car accident shortly afterward. But Gary tracked down the man's secretary, who confirmed the notary had been in another state that entire week. He could not have notarized anything. The evidence was overwhelming, but Riley wanted a confession. That was when I realized Will's greatest weakness was his ego. He always needed to feel smarter than everyone else. If I made him believe he had won, he might expose himself. I told the group I needed to call him and pretend I was ready to sign. Margie was worried and reminded me how dangerous he was. I agreed, but also knew his greed would make him careless. When I called him, I cried and sounded defeated. I told him he had won and that I could not fight anymore. I begged for my mother's jewelry box back. He immediately softened, convinced of his victory. He offered me more money if I signed everything over, insisting the process be final and legal, with witnesses present. After the call ended, Gary smiled for the first time in days. Will wanted witnesses. That meant we could give him exactly the kind he did not expect. The next day, I called Will again and told him I remembered something my father had mentioned shortly before his death. I spoke about a possible account connected to my mother, maybe a safety deposit box at a bank. I claimed I did not want trouble, only enough money to start over. Will took the bait instantly. The possibility of more money made him eager and reckless. He believed me because he wanted to. That afternoon, Will arrived at the house with his girlfriend, Tiffany. She was young, excited by the lifestyle he promised her, convinced he was wealthy. She talked endlessly about yachts, luxury trips, and a future funded by money she believed was already his. While Margie pretended to help me pack my remaining belongings, Will tore through the house searching for information about the supposed account. His desperation grew until he grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise me, demanding details I did not have. I repeated that my father had only mentioned the bank and my mother's name. Will immediately began calling his banking contacts, trying to trace any hidden assets. Meanwhile, the recording devices placed by Detective Riley captured everything. Conversations between Will and Veronica revealed their plans to sell the company quickly, their discussions about medication dosages, and even their contingency plans for me if I did not cooperate. By that evening, Riley confirmed they had enough evidence, but she wanted to identify everyone involved, including whoever had helped supply the medication. The final step would be the meeting Will had scheduled at my father's office. That meeting would be our chance to end everything. The night before the meeting, Margie asked me if I was truly ready. She reminded me that I had already been through more pain than most people experience in a lifetime. I thought about my father dying slowly while trusting the people who were poisoning him. I thought about my baby and how the stress of everything may have contributed to my miscarriage. I also thought about the families Veronica had destroyed before mine. I told Margie I was ready. They had forced me to choose how I would pay, and now they were going to learn the real cost of what they had done. The morning of the meeting, my nerves were so bad that I became physically ill. Margie stayed with me, reminding me that I was my father's daughter, and that his strength lived on in me. She made a small joke about Will's poorly dyed hair, and for the first time, I smiled. When we arrived at my father's office, everything still felt frozen in time. His coffee mug sat on the desk where he left it, and the room still carried the faint scent of his cologne. Will had already taken my father's chair, sitting with his feet on the desk as if he owned everything. Tiffany was busy taking photos in front of my father's awards, posing as if the office belonged to her. Will pushed the papers toward me and demanded that we finish things quickly. He explained that by signing, I would give up all claims to the estate and the company in exchange for a small payout, after which I would disappear from his life forever. I asked about the company employees and their profit-sharing agreements. Will laughed and said it was no longer his problem. He admitted that the company was being sold the next day for far less than it was worth because he wanted the matter resolved immediately. That admission was captured clearly by the recording device. Veronica then entered the room carrying a bottle of champagne, smiling as if this were a celebration. She pretended to care about my recovery and casually implied that stress from fighting over the will may have contributed to my miscarriage. I struggled to control my anger and instead asked how long they had been planning everything. She dismissed the question with laughter, claiming they were only honoring my father's wishes. I then mentioned that I had seen emails between her and Will discussing how to handle my father long before his death. Will reacted angrily, accusing me of hacking his email. I reminded him that he had left his computer logged in when he threw me out of the house. Tiffany became confused and began asking questions, but Will tried to silence her and push me to sign. I picked up the pen and paused, asking one final question. I asked how my father had really died. Veronica immediately claimed it was heart failure. I calmly stated that it had nothing to do with the triple dosage of heart medication they had been slipping into his coffee. The room went silent. Will stood up slowly, denying everything, but I repeated his own words back to him from the emails. As the truth began to surface, Vincent, the notary Will had brought, started edging toward the door. I continued, stating clearly that Will had murdered my father, just as Veronica had murdered her previous husbands. Veronica insisted there was no proof. I told her the medication had been tested, the real will was already with my father's lawyer, and the notary who supposedly witnessed the fake document had been proven absent. Will lunged at me in a rage, but I moved aside and he crashed into a filing cabinet. Tiffany screamed, finally realizing that the life she had been promised was built on lies. Will shouted that I was setting him up, but before he could say anything else, the door opened. Detective Riley entered with federal agents. They announced the arrests of Will and Veronica for murder, embezzlement, wire fraud, and numerous additional charges. Will tried to run but was tackled almost immediately. Vincent attempted to escape through a window but became stuck. Will shouted that I had attacked him first at the doctor's office, but Detective Riley showed him the security footage proving otherwise. His face drained of color as the reality set in. Veronica attempted to destroy evidence on her phone, but Margie struck it from her hand with her purse. Veronica screamed accusations, but Margie calmly dismissed them. Tiffany broke down completely, screaming about the lies she had believed and the future she had bragged about. She lashed out at Will, hitting him with the expensive bag he had bought her using stolen money. The agents allowed it briefly before pulling her away. As Will was taken out in handcuffs, employees from the company gathered in the hallway. When they learned the truth, some cried with relief, while others had to be restrained from attacking him. They spoke about how my father had helped them through illnesses, paid for education, and supported their families. Will had been planning to destroy all of it. The confrontation was over. Justice was finally in motion. The trial that followed became a public spectacle. Will hired 3 different lawyers, each one quitting when the amount of evidence against him became impossible to ignore. The financial crimes alone were enough to put him in prison for decades, but the murder charge changed everything. The prosecution explained that Will had been stealing from the company for years. When my father began to suspect something was wrong, Will needed a permanent solution. That was when Veronica stepped in, a woman with a long and carefully hidden history. The prosecutor laid out her past marriages, one by one. Each husband had died from medical causes within a few years of marrying her. Each had left her everything. My father had been the 4th. Medical experts testified that my father's death was caused by digitalis poisoning administered slowly over several months. The dosage had been carefully calculated to mimic natural decline. The courtroom fell silent as the pattern became impossible to deny. Tiffany was called to testify. Her testimony, though careless and shallow, became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence. She admitted that Will had told her his stepfather was dying anyway, and that they were only helping him along. He had promised her millions, a life of luxury, and a future built on money she never questioned. Each word she spoke stripped away what little defense Will had left. Investigators later discovered Veronica's storage unit. Inside were items she had kept from each husband, wedding rings, watches, and detailed medical notes. She had researched their conditions extensively before marrying them. My father's records were there as well, annotated with dosage changes and timelines. His death had been planned down to the week. Gary took the stand and presented my father's real will and the letter he had written to me. The judge called a recess after reading it. In the letter, my father explained that he knew he was being poisoned, but chose to endure it long enough to gather evidence and protect me. He died knowing the truth would come out. Employees from the company testified about the pension fund Will had drained. Some had worked there for decades and depended on that money for retirement. Other families came forward, sharing stories of loved ones they believed Veronica had killed but could never prove. A clear pattern emerged, one that could no longer be ignored. Evidence of Will's gambling debts was also presented. He owed nearly $1 million to dangerous people, which explained his desperation to sell the company quickly. His greed, fear, and arrogance had driven every decision he made. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Will was found guilty on all counts. He received life in prison for murder, along with additional decades for federal crimes. Veronica was sentenced to multiple life terms. She showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Vincent, the fake notary, was sentenced for fraud and agreed to testify in other cases involving Will. Additional charges were added to Will's sentence as more crimes came to light. Justice did not end with punishment. The company was saved. With proper management, it was worth more than anyone had realized. The employee pension fund was fully restored with interest. People cried when they learned their futures were secure again. After the trial, Gary gave me a letter my father had left with him, to be opened only after everything was over. Inside was a key and an address. It led to another safety deposit box, created years earlier as insurance. Inside were bonds and a note addressed to his future grandchildren, a promise of love he knew he might never deliver in person. I later learned that Detective Riley used the case to help create a task force focused on elder abuse and inheritance fraud. Margie received recognition for her forensic work, proudly accepting an award that celebrated her role in uncovering the truth. Life slowly moved forward. Underwood Construction thrived. I stepped into my father's role and discovered that I had inherited his instincts. We secured a contract to build a new children's hospital, something my father had always dreamed of completing. I also found love again. The doctor who treated me during my emergency became someone I could trust, someone gentle and honest. When I told him I was afraid to try for another child, he told me he would stand by me no matter what I chose. We married quietly. When I later learned I was pregnant again, I went to my father's grave and told him everything. The company was safe. The people he cared about were protected. Justice had been served. They had thought I was weak. They believed grief and pain would make me surrender. But where they expected me to break, I survived. And this time, hope lived on.